very excited to introduce our next guest, Maajid Nawaz. I know we've all been huge fans of his. I've been a big fan of his since I saw him as a guest of Sam Harris's at the State Theatre in Sydney 4 years ago. We walked out going, Maajid is the real star of that show. Born into a British-Pakistani family, he joined Hizb ut-Tahrir, yes, Hizb ut-Tahrir, as a young hothead, got arrested, spent 5 years in an Egyptian jail before Amnesty helped get him out, and after which he had, as he describes it himself, or to put it mildly, a change of heart. He is now the founding chairman of Quilliam, a UK-based counter-extremism think tank that challenges Islamist extremists. He has written 2 books, Radical, about his journey out of radical Islam, and Islam and the Future of Tolerance. Maajid stood for Parliament in the 2015 British election, and best of all, he hosts a fantastic radio show on London's LBC every Saturday and Sunday. So delighted to have you here on Outsiders. Maajid Nawaz, welcome. How are you?
Thank you. That was a very kind introduction. Thank you very much. Very well.
Our pleasure. And I hope you enjoyed Sydney when you were here, and I hope you'll be back again. But just very briefly, just give us the, I know you've told it a zillion times, but just give us the kind of 60-second version of your background through Hizb ut-Tahrir through to LBC, if we can condense it.
I think you just did, but I will say that, yes, in my youth, in my teenage years, I joined a legal yet extreme Islamist organisation. You still have some of their acolytes in Australia who sometimes pop up in the news. I was, as you said, in prison for 5 years, adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience. Eventually, upon my release, completing my sentence, still at the age of around 28 years old, I changed my world outlook, voluntarily decided to abandon the organization and dedicate the rest of my life to challenging not only my previously held extreme views, the ideology of Islamism, but also trying to argue for reason and reform, not within my fellow Muslim communities, but generally within society. I think we sometimes forget our reason about us, and it's important, I think, to be reminded sometimes.
Rita.
Well, you've had such a remarkable few years. I want to ask firstly just about your battle with SPLC, because you took them to court. They put you on some sort of anti-Muslim extremist list, which is insane because you're a Muslim, you're just a reformer.
Yes.
And you said, I'm not going to stand by this, and tell us the outcome of that case.
Yes, well, for a long, long time. In fact, you mentioned my autobiography. That was written in 2011, published in 2012. I coined the phrase regressive left that you have referred to in that autobiography. And the reason I did is because what I found is that as a Muslim coming from the background that I had, you know, I've graduated in the Arabic language. I memorized half of the Quran, and I felt that it was my right to speak about my own communities, my own religious views that I used to hold, and to try and encourage a liberal, democratic, secular reform within Muslim communities. But unfortunately, the people that I thought would be my strongest allies, those who claim ordinarily to speak up on behalf of reform Muslims, secular Muslims, liberal Muslims, were the ones who basically declared intellectual warfare on me for wanting to reform within my communities. And the pinnacle of their efforts culminated in the Southern Poverty Law Center in the United States of America, listing me as an anti-Muslim extremist. So I decided to file for a defamation lawsuit in the US. And what follows was perhaps a highlight of my life. I won $3.4 million from the Southern Poverty Law Center with a full throttle video apology. Then the very next week, the CEO resigned in disgrace, and then their president resigned. Or in the opposite order, I should say. Maurice Dees resigned first, and then Richard Cohen resigned, their CEO, amidst allegations from their own staff of racism and sexism. So the entire thing capitulated after we won that case.
Fantastic work, James.
They got rid of, I was going to just say, they got rid of that entire list, didn't they? And that list included the likes of Ayan Hirsi Ali and a lot of other human rights campaigners.
It did. And look, you know, in the 1950s, McCarthyism was about looking for people on the left, you know, Reds under the beds. People on the left should be aware of this history, what happens when you start compiling political lists, personas non grata, hit lists, people you don't like, people you want to deplatform. It doesn't end well. It never ends well. The only type of list I'd encourage people to write is Santa Claus's list, because they're writing for gifts for their kids over Christmas.
James.
I want to move on from intellectual combat to perhaps the more sort of serious kind. You've written about the ongoing coronavirus crisis and China's attempts to play off of that as part of a much bigger global rivalry and global combat, and essentially a war footing that they've gone on that I think a lot of us in the West don't recognize. I'd love it if you could walk us through a bit of that, because I think our listeners and our viewers, are very concerned about this, and we'd love to hear you expound upon this idea.
Of course, just to reassure your readers, because this seems an odd segue from my time as an Islamist radical beating the SPLC to talking about China. What's happened since then, as you mentioned with LBC, is I've been heavily engaged in geopolitical and geostrategic analysis, as well as political commentary, which is essentially a continuation of my intentions to do work for the public good. I just had the wrong way of doing it when I joined Hizb ut-Tahrir. So in that context, I've been writing and speaking and debating a lot about foreign policy, which has always fascinated me. And China, as you correctly mentioned, is something that has been a bit of a bugbear of mine recently. I first became aware of the incredible danger that the Chinese Communist Party poses for the world when I learned that they intern 2 million Uyghur Muslims in their concentration camps. In a form of like mass incarceration, no trial. They call it re-education, and it's basically like Stalin's gulags. And that first alerted me to the danger of China. And so then what I did is I write a column for Unheard, which is UNHERD. It's a platform that I write for here. I asked them to let me write for a column on China, because I believe, folks, and I'm happy to elaborate if you want me to, I believe that China is preparing for war with us, and we're in a cold war with them. Whether or not we go to war is a completely different conversation. I'm not predicting war, nor am I encouraging it. I'm saying that the Chinese Communist Party is preparing for it, and they have a strategy for us in the West. And I'm afraid we have no strategy for dealing with them. And China, in particular, you will know in Australia, this is a topic of concern there for your politicians as well.
Maajid, I agree totally with you there that we must be very, very careful. That's something we have talked about. I also wanted to pick your brains on this. There's this phrase in Britain, BAME, which stands for Black, Asian, Middle Eastern. It's not a phrase we have here in Australia, but it basically refers to people of colour or people who aren't white. There's this story now that there's an intent within the NHS, the British Medical Service, to have BAME people, Black, Asian, Middle Eastern people, not serving on the front line of COVID-19, of the coronavirus, but only to have young whites on the front line because the BAME people are supposedly more likely to get infected. What is this racist madness, Maajid?
Yeah, look, this is a kind of policy, a bit like affirmative action, known as positive discrimination, that is born of good intentions, but in the end results in more division. So one can accept two thoughts at the same time. Thought number one, that perhaps, for example, when they originally came out with affirmative action, as an example, there was a lack of representation of people that look like me or Rita in the public eye. So that's a valid concern to have. But the way you go and try and address that concern shouldn't make the problem worse. So it is correct that there has been a disproportionate number of ethnic minority deaths in the United Kingdom because of coronavirus. Now, the reasons for that are yet to be studied and yet to be fully understood. If I to hazard a guess, it's probably something to do with poverty, probably something with diet. It could be something to do with vitamin D and immunity because of sunlight. There are many reasons which need to be studied afterwards, but we know already that there's a disproportionate effect. But the way to solve that and the way to address it isn't by having a discriminatory policy in that way. Some people want to work because they see this as being on the front line in something that is analogous to a war effort. And if I wanted to be a soldier, for example, and I had a slimmer build than somebody that had a bigger build or was perhaps a trained athlete, and I wasn't, but I volunteered to fight, for example, Hitler, you wouldn't say to me, well, you're a bit too slim, actually. You know what? We're going to take the guy that's martial arts trained because he has a better chance of survival. You would let me volunteer. So I think there are sensible ways around this. We always give the analogy that this is a war effort. We salute our National Health Service on Thursday evenings here in London at 8 p.m. in the United Kingdom, I should say. So we're acting as if this is a war effort. So there are people who know they're at risk, whether they're doctors and nurses, who consider it an honor to serve. And that's how we should approach this conversation.
Maajid Nawaz, fantastic. We could chat all day. I hope we can get you back again. It's so refreshing to hear your thoughts and your point of view. Love your radio show. I urge people to buy your books as well, Radical and Islam with Sam Harris, which you wrote. Thanks so much for joining us here on Outsiders, and keep safe in London there.
Thank you. Thank you very much. An absolute pleasure. I'm sorry about the lighting and everything. Obviously, we're in lockdown, so I don't know if you can see me properly, but thank you.
It's all great stuff. Thanks so much, Maajid Nawaz.